Yamsketch.
Hey guys, what's up? So I want to talk a little bit about custom brushes, and I'm on my Wacom Cintiq right now, and I'm in Photoshop, and I just want to show a little bit more, and I hope I can turn this into like a little thing of a series, because the thing about custom brushes is I've seen a lot of people touch on it, but they don't really go into much depth. So, you know, at the end of the thing, you have like a cube brush and that's it. And there's a lot you can do with brushes. So I want to kind of talk about that. So I'm going to try to keep these short. So I'm going to make a few of these. But I want to start, and we'll start with the basics, but we're not going to end there. We're going to build on this. So there's a lot of ways to make brushes. And let's just start with the obvious. You pull out the brush, which you can get to here, you can get to here, right? And then just grab that circle brush. So what do? You get, you know, a little circle. So the thing is that all brush presets are black and white, and they can have grayscale, but there's no color. That's the important thing. And then they're all just based on a single shape that gets modified like a stamp. So it goes stamp, 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 but it stamps a lot of them together really closely so it looks like a line. So you can modify those properties, and those are all in the brush settings here. And by modifying them, you can do a lot of different things. So you probably know that much, but the reason I'm talking about that is because that's how we can change things. So based on what we know about how we can change them, we can find the best ways to make things that we want to make. So for now, I'll show you some basic ways to start. So a great way is to use the selection tool. So let's just make a little square. Let's fill that. There, we got a black square. Let's make a little circle. And you'll notice I'm not being perfect about this. The reason is because I don't actually want perfect brushes, but I'll explain more about that later. And another way is to use the lasso tool. So let's just make a weird lasso like that. So these are all great ways to make a base brush. The other way you can do it is you can just grab one of your base brushes and you can draw something in. So let's draw a little blotch, okay? And what I really like about my favorite brushes is that typically I take a base brush, we make some modifications to it, I use that to draw another base, which ends up actually becoming the brush. So I'll show you what I mean. But all brushes are created by making a selection around your black and white. The white is basically treated as transparent, so you don't have to get this perfect selection. You can just whatever, as long as you don't have, you know, something else in there that you don't want. So just grab this loosely, go there, edit, and you'll see define brush preset. So if I hit that, you can name this whatever you want. You'll get a brush name. Okay, boom. And then now go to your brush. Down at the bottom, you can see I made one earlier here. Your new one will be here. So the base settings for this new one are always terrible. And I don't know why these are the default settings. But the spacing's huge, so it just looks like this, whatever that is, a bunch of panes of glass. So go to your brush settings, and immediately there's a couple of things that I always do. First, unless you have like the worst video card or no RAM, just turn the spacing all the way down. So now you get a nice smooth stroke. If that is chugging your computer, you could turn this up to 3 or 4%, and then it'll be a little bit less smooth, but it won't chug. But basically what this does is, like we were saying, it stamps out this pattern, and then it stamps it out so close that it looks like a line, but it's not actually a line. It's never a line. It's just a bunch of these things stamped together. So that's going to come into play later. Now, what I like about a square brush, actually I'll space this out so you can actually see it, is that you can crush it and you can also angle it. Now with a circle brush, it's not really going to make any difference, to change the angle. But with a square brush like this, you get a calligraphic, you guys can help me say that, calligraphic effect. And you can also create things like marker pens, anything that has like a chunky felt tip. Those things are really cool. So right now, if I turn the spacing back down to reasonable, you can see that I can already get some nice thick to thin stuff in the line, even without changing the actual pressure thick to thin. So that's really cool. You can see that, just by changing that, if I go down to a smaller size, I have kind of a neat little drawing brush that I can use. Okay, so that's good for starters. Let's grab this one and see what we get. So we will go edit, again, define brush preset, boom. I usually don't say worry about naming these first ones because I delete them. And again, I delete them because I make modifications to them and then I save that one. So I'll show you that. So I like to just make this part kind of go quick. So if I grab all these and just make a little preset with each one, so boom, there, we have all our presets. And then now we get ready to make some modifications because, again, as soon as you make a new preset, it gives you that same set of garbage settings. So if I turn this spacing down, you can see now, okay, I have a round brush. Neat, right? It's just the typical round brush. It's not very exciting. Now, if I modify this and I squash it down, I can create like a brush stroke. And if I add Shape Dynamics pen pressure to it, then, you know, I can create, you know, push harder to get thicker, that kind of thing. So that's nice. And especially if I make the stroke thicker, that's more pronounced. I can have very thin strokes, very thick strokes. That's nice, and that could be a useful brush for inking, for comics or something like that. It's not great yet, but it could be a good start. But that's two basic brushes, and that's a basic place to start. All right, okay. So I don't know what this guy's deal is, but we kind of want to get more interesting than that. So if we go to our next one here, you can see I've got this blob that was created by the lasso. Same thing, garbage settings. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to change the spacing down to something reasonable. I've got my weird blob now. I'm going to go to Shape Dynamics. I'm going to turn this down to a size that's a little bit more reasonable. And you can see, okay, now I have something that's actually starting to look a little bit interesting. This is like a bristle brush. So already I like this more than the other things we've created because I tend to like things that look like something I've used in real life. And that's starting to look like a bristle brush. The problem is if I make this stroke 3 times, it looks the same 3 times. So when I'm trying to make a brush or an actual pen or something that sort of mimics something in the real world, what I'm looking for is variety and variance. So I want it to change when I use it. I don't want it to look like there's one stroke here and then on a building or something, and then I have a character over here and there's another stroke and it's the same stroke. I don't want that to appear anywhere in a drawing. So the way that you can start to do this is with all this stuff. So texture, scatter, dual brush, these are all ways where you can add variety. The other thing is angle jitter, right? So again, if I spread this out, you could see it a little bit better. I'm going to spread it out while we work on it, then we'll turn it back down and get our smooth shape. So if you spread it out, you see that each individual shape is actually the same right now. So what we're going to do is first we're going to squash it just a little bit. See, I can kind of mess with it. And then the reason I'm doing that is I'm going to give it a little bit of an angle jitter. So this is just going to vary the angle a little bit. And because it's squashed, it's going to give a little bit of sort of a bias to that angle, okay? So that's the squash there. I could vary that a lot, but I'm just gonna put a little bit here, okay? You can control it with different things. You know, we'll just leave this at pin tilt, that's fine. Although, let's put it on direction. That'll give it some angularity. So that's nice. Scattering. Now here's the thing about scattering. Scattering spreads these guys out so they kind of blotch everywhere. And it can turn into one of those like spatter pen or like pattern brush things. But again, I like to use this stuff subtly. So I'm just going to scatter it a little bit. And I'm only going to scatter it in this axis, the width axis. So all I'm looking for here is just a little bit of variety and spatter. I'm going to make that also based on pen pressure, so we'll get more of it the harder we push. So the thicker the ink is, the more it kind of bleeds. Okay, and then texture. Texture is a really interesting one, and I haven't made any textures, so I'm just going to use the basic ones I have here. But let's give it a granite texture. stone. And the reason I'm doing that is just because if you look at this, it just gives it some kind of noise, okay? So there's different modes here. You can play with this. We'll leave this all right now for just kind of how it is. You can kind of see what happens when I start to play with these things. I'm not gonna worry about it yet, okay? And then I'm going to go back to the brush tip shape. I'm going to turn the spacing way back down so that we can start to see what this brush actually feels like. And you can see that now we're getting this kind of blotchy, splotchy bleed brush. And this is starting to be interesting to me already. Like I said, I don't want something that looks the same each time I stroke it. Now when I stroke this, and then I draw it again, and I could draw this many times, but now it's harder for someone to see that the stroke is, you know, based on the same brush. It looks like a tool rather than a stamp, okay? But I still want some of the sharpness and the quality of that other brush that we had before. So you can continue to play with these things. You see, if I go too strong, we're gonna get a whole other thing like a fur brush or an effect brush. But the basic point with a lot of this stuff is when you're looking for something to get like a little roughened, but sort of natural, so, you know, like a real tool in real life, you want to be subtle with it. So you don't want to go all nuts and put all this stuff like this, right? You can tweak it a little bit, but you want to stay a little bit more subtle and think about what you're trying to achieve. So if I go too nuts with the scattering, again, you're just going to get a big crazy thing. What I'm looking for is to use the scattering as a way to just make this bleed out a little bit more. So to put this here, so in our texture now, what's cool is if we play with the scale of this texture a little bit, I want this to, there we go. So I kind of want this to stay crisper in the middle and then just bleed out at the end like I'm touching down on paper. You can see now, because it's based on pen pressure, when I press really lightly, I just get a scrape along, like I'm kind of hitting the tooth of the paper. And again, any kind of stone pattern works pretty well for paper tooth. You could actually make your own patterns, and we'll get into that in another way. But for now, anything like that that has some noisiness, that is really good, because you're trying to think of like little pieces of paper, little pieces of canvas or whatever you're drawing on that would just sort of pick up the ink or the paint a little bit more. So I'm going for sort of like an ink pen or a blot pen kind of a thing right now. But yeah, we'll work on that. So some of the things that are really cool besides what we just did, as I'm not going to worry about color because this is an inking pen, but you can screw around with noise. So you can add a little bit more noise to things. You can wet edges, which actually I really like. That is for a more of a brush, but it will push the darker areas to the edge of the pen. And that can be really useful for markers sometimes too, where you can see that when I stroke and stroke again, it multiplies, so it gets darker. And if you've ever used any water-based or alcohol-based marker, you know, that's what they do. Like they dry, and then when you dry over them, you go over them again, it gets darker in that same area. So if you're trying to mimic that, that's an easy and quick way to do it. Other than that though, I usually just stay up here in the top, and if you get these parts right, the actual brush shape itself, and then some of the shape dynamic stuff, and then a little bit of texture here, which is just to add some roughness to the brush, you're I don't know, 80-90% of the way there. So you don't usually have to fool with this stuff. At least I find that I don't usually have to. So when you get something working well, you know, on a large scale, I usually do this. I make it at a large scale so I can really see the grain, the texture that I'm working on. And then when I pull it down real small again at the size that I'm probably actually going to use it, I know that all of that's there. And even though I probably have to zoom in to see it now, the cool thing is that you still feel it. And especially if you're going to draw a comic, or if you're going to make an illustration, if you do the whole illustration or comic page or whatever with a stock brush, and then you do the same thing with a brush that now has some kind of grit and grain and a little bit of variance to it, even though essentially this is just like a little round brush because it's based on a round shape. I mean, round-ish, right? It's basically round. So I have a round brush here, but I would take this brush here over this brush any day because this brush is like pretty boring as it stands without being tweaked. And then this brush is actually already pretty useful. So actually, I mean, we should make this guy happy because we made a nice brush. Yay! So he's like happy but constipated. I don't know. So we can fix that. Now he's just happy. So he is, let's see, what kind of, he's like a pompadour dude. That's what a happy dude would be. He's like a happy the Fonz. Ah, yeah. All right, so anyway, why did I make this initial blotch this big instead of yay big? It's because when you make it this big, you just don't have that much information. You don't have that much pixel data to work with. And so you can't do that much with it. When you start with something this size, the little changes that you make actually matter. And then when you shrink it down, everything looks really crisp and nice. If I zoom in on this, you'll see that the detail does actually come through, right? It's got all the features of those larger strokes. It's just that it's not overkill. You know, if you zoom in with a magnifying glass on a pen, you'll see all this bleeding into the paper and cool stuff like that happens. But people don't look at stuff with magnifying glasses very often. Like, that's not what's important. What's important is that it feels right. And for it to feel right, you want to have the details in there. So just make sure that they're there. Again, an easy way to do that is make the brush adjustments large. Even that thing I was showing you where I actually go to the brush tip shape and put the spacing out so I can see what I'm doing to the individual dots that make up this brush stroke. See, they're all getting tweaked and modified. And I know that each one is a little bit different so that when I create the line by jombling them all together, that's going to look like nice and varied and different too. So that's my first little intro on this. And we're going to keep doing some more. We're going to look at some ways that you can layer this. So this is just a basic base brush. And then from this base, we can actually make even more complicated brushes. And by complicated, doesn't mean that you have to, learn new techniques exactly. It just means that you create a nice base brush and you use that base to make another base, and then you kind of make the settings layered that way. And then you get a more complicated brush, which really is very unique to you because now you've added your spin to it a number of times. Once you have the brush like this, so this is pretty important. So once you have a brush that you like, so you set up this base brush, and we save that out into a preset by going to Edit, Define Brush Preset. That's neat, but now that you've added settings and changes to it, it's actually a new thing now. So the first thing to do is you don't want to lose that. So here again, you can always create a new brush preset with what you have. But I actually recommend creating a tool preset instead. So the difference between that is the brush preset is basically just the shape, and that's useful. But the tool preset actually preserves all the settings that you've created that go along with it, and all the little things that modify that brush shape. So that's where the tool preset comes in. So I actually recommend going to here, the little tiny arrow, then this other little tiny arrow. I don't know, like Photoshop loves tiny arrows. What can I say? And then just saying new tool preset. So you can see I have all my Kyle brush in here. I love Kyle brush. But I also like making my own brushes. So I'm not going to include the color because I don't care. This could be a brush to use with any color. Otherwise, if you include that, it's going to snap it to whatever color we're in now, which is black. But usually I don't include that because, I don't want my brushes to throw my colors around. So now is when it's important to name it. When I'm just making my little brush tip, I don't usually name things because it's a waste of time. But when you're actually making the brush, that's pretty useful. So let's call this something like yamsketch. And sorry, my keyboard's over here. Maybe my voice is going away. So we're going to call this yamsketch, and then let's call it pocket pen. It does kind of look like a pocket pen. Pocket pen. All right, they don't pay me to spell. So now you can see that I've got this. It is cool to categorize things that way when you make a series of items, they'll all appear in the same place. But anyway, now you won't lose this brush. Now you've got this brush. Now if we pop away from it to one of Kyle's rad pens, and then we pop back, boom, we got our pocket pen. So that's an important thing. I want to make sure that you guys got that. Thanks for hanging out, guys, and I hope that was useful.
Yamsketch.